What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So I regret to inform you that I have decided to drop my current playthrough of Fire Emblem Thracia 776. And this was definitely not for lack of trying. I'm currently on chapter 20. While that chapter doesn't seem like the biggest hurdle I've had to overcome during my time with this game, it's more that I've been slowly losing interest the further I've gotten into it, which I'm actually really bummed about because there's quite a bit about this game that I really like, at least conceptually. And I was actually really enjoying a lot of the unique aspects earlier on, to the point where I pushed through some pretty steep hurdles to even get close to where I'm stopping at. I'm sure that I'll come back to it at some point down the road, but the position I'm in right now is that play sessions have been kind of a chore for the past several chapters, and it's gotten to the point where I feel like I'm just kind of going through the motions, which is never a good place to be. But that's also not to say that I think this game is bad, actually very far from it, and I do want to, as I tend to do in these types of videos, break down as many aspects as I can and maybe give you guys a little bit of a better idea of my experience with this game as well. But before I get into that, I am trying to hit 1,000 subscribers as soon as I can so that I can set a new goal for the end of 2024. This is certainly one of my favorite video game franchises and is one where my love for it has grown pretty significantly since I started talking about these games on the channel and playing through a number of Fire Emblems that I had never played before. Now, normally I would start with presentation, but I feel like the presentation of this game kind of speaks for itself. It came to the Super Famicom in 1999, which was several years into the N64 life cycle and just a few short years before the GameCube even came out. So you can kind of assume that Intelligent Systems was leveraging the power of the Super Famicom as much as they possibly could, given how long the tools to develop games for that system were around. And so I'm going to go right into story, but I'm not going to spoil anything directly, although for those interested in checking this game out, I highly recommend playing through Genealogy of the Holy War first, since these games are very intimately connected. Thracia 776 takes place in between the first and second half of Genealogy, and even the opening crawl of Thracia spoils some major events from the first half of Genealogy. The main thing I want to say about the story is that it's on a much smaller scale than that of FE4, because it's focused on the country of Thracia within the continent of Jugdral, whereas FE4's story takes place across the entire continent. And so what comes from this smaller scale story is something much more personal, both to Leif, who is the main lord of this game, but also the cast in general. And due to that more intimate style of storytelling, Thracia is able to show a lot of darker elements that were introduced in FE4 more directly. Yes, there are plenty of dark elements in FE4, but they were mostly told to you in a way that's like, this is happening elsewhere. Whereas in Thracia, you not only hear about a lot of these atrocities more often, but you even get to see more of it firsthand. The setup for the plot is basically that Leif is trying to take back his homeland. And as far as the cast of characters in this game, I actually quite liked them. It's kind of hard for me to speak on the characters super deeply because I've been chipping away at this game over the course of like 2 months. And so it's hard to remember all the details, but I can at least recall some character moments between Leif and Dagdar, or with Olwyn and Fred, for instance. And I'd say that these character moments that are coming to mind do tie a little more strongly into the Gaiden chapters, which you unlock by meeting certain conditions in the prior chapter. And this is something that I'd probably recommend looking up ahead of time. And I know there are other videos out there about Thracia that heavily suggest doing research beforehand or having some idea of what you're getting into. I'm not an expert on this game, so I would definitely point you towards Mecha's beginner's guides for this game, since I'm far from qualified to talk about that kind of stuff. But I do think that looking up the requirements to unlock the Gaiden chapters would be worth it, because not only do you get some really good resources, be it recruitable units, weapons, items, etc., but it also fleshes out some of these characters as individuals more. And from the Gaiden requirement page on Serenus Forest for Thracia 776, there's not really anything you'd be spoiled on by looking at these to try to unlock them. And there are even some that I missed because I didn't look into every single one of these, but I did do quite a few of them. Despite this game being very connected to Genealogy narratively, Thracia feels way more like a GBA Fire Emblem than I ever expected. Or rather, this game set more of a clear foundation for what the GBA games, and really Fire Emblem in general, would be from that point on, which was extremely refreshing coming off of Genealogy of the Holy War. I think the most striking thing about this game from a gameplay standpoint is how well it mirrors the narrative. So because Leif is trying to liberate his homeland from already being taken over, as opposed to trying to drive off an oppressive threat, as you see in a lot of other Fire Emblem games, that means that Leif and company are almost always on the back foot and feel very underpowered, or at the very least undermanned compared to the oppression that you're rising up against. And you really do feel that in the gameplay of this game, primarily because of how limited your resources are. But this game not only mirrors its own narrative through gameplay, but actually portrays the relative power level between FE4's army and FE5's, primarily through the power level of Leif compared to the other units in the army. Where in FE4, I found Leif to be mostly useless, whereas in FE5, Leif can actually hold his own on the front lines fairly well. And I love how that really does reflect that Leif is but a young noble among much more powerful nobles, with horses no less, in FE4, whereas in FE5, he is a noble among an army primarily consisting of common folk that he just scrounges together on his journey. Something else that surprised me about Thracia was that rescue dropping was actually introduced in this game, and not the GBA games, which I had previously assumed. I shouldn't be too surprised because I knew that capturing was a mechanic in this game. The way that capturing works is fairly reminiscent to how rescuing works, and rescue dropping is one of the most useful tools at your disposal in the Fire Emblem games where it's present, allowing you to take weaker units out of danger and or carry them over walls or across larger distances that they couldn't otherwise travel, passing them across several units to get them into a certain position for combat purposes or for trading purposes. But then of course when it comes to the capture mechanic specifically, which is something that is pretty much exclusive to this game, I think there might be a unit or two in Bates that has access to capture, but it's such a niche thing that you might not even end up utilizing. Whereas in this game, it's pretty integral to the design. I've already mentioned that Leif's army is way out of their league when it comes to the force that they're going up against. And so another way that the gameplay of this game reflects that point about the narrative, your primary means of acquiring equipment in this game is not from finding vendors and armorers and purchasing it from them, but from taking the equipment of your enemies. And sure, you can use a thief to steal certain items, but primarily this is going to be through the capture mechanic, which anyone can do. However, the unit that you are attempting to capture with needs to have a higher constitution than the unit that you are trying to capture. But if you meet that criteria, then the capture command will show up in the menu when you are standing directly next to another unit. You can't capture from a distance because that wouldn't really make much sense. But what the capture command does is puts you into a combat scenario with the enemy. As far as I understand, as someone who hasn't looked into the specifics, it seems that some combination of your attack power, accuracy, and attack speed are affected and lowered, which makes sense because if you're trying to hold back so as to not kill the enemy, then yeah, you might end up missing by accident or not doing enough damage to weaken them enough to capture them, etc., etc. But mechanically, you need to get them to 0 HP using the capture command specifically. And so assuming that you succeed, they get pulled into the unit that you captured them with, similar to when you rescue an allied unit, at which point you can trade with the captured unit, and you can also pass around captured enemies, similar to how rescue dropping works. And so a big component to this game is capturing enemy units to take their weapons and vulneraries, and even some unique and rare items as well, in order to try to give your army the best chance it has to liberate the country of Thracia. And I quite like this system, especially because there's a big element of risk reward where not only are you risking failing the capture because of the lowered accuracy and attack power and whatever, but also once you bring that unit in, if you successfully capture, then your stats are lowered because you're holding on to someone, putting you more at risk for other enemies that might be nearby. And the same goes if you fail the capture, you're just leaving yourself open to being punished. And so it's something that I wouldn't say is a win more strat per se, but it's something you want to be very sure of before you attempt it, especially because of how often this game will just kick your teeth in out of nowhere. This game is definitely on the harder side as far as Fire Emblem games on their base difficulty, which I guess you would say would be normal for the other games that have actual difficulty modes. There is a slightly easier difficulty, so to speak, called Paragon mode in this game that gives every one of your units the skill Paragon, which doubles earned experience. And while I guess that would help you more so in the early game, the stat caps in this game are really low. And even some of my units that capped some of their more useful stats still felt just as at risk as any of my other weaker units stat-wise. This game's difficulty really doesn't stem so much from raw stats, which is something else that I really appreciate, but it's more so from the actual circumstances that you're put into. Not only the comparative lack of resources between you and the enemy, but also with how varied the maps are in this game. Almost all of the objectives in Thracia are some combination of seize, escape, and defend, the last two of which are fairly uncommon in most Fire Emblems. And there are a good number of Fire Emblem games where the only objective is seas, or at least most of the maps are seas. And so, okay, simple enough, defeat the boss to clear the throne and get the Lord to seize the throne, right? And you would think escape would work the same way as well, but the way that deployment works in Thracia prevents the player from exploiting the fact that a lot of the maps are seize and escape, which in a lot of other entries means you could simply warp your Lord to the throne or to the escape point and just win the map immediately. Not so in Thracia. I mean, seize maps you could conceivably do that, considering that Leif can actually hold his own in combat. But while most Fire Emblems have a maximum deployment threshold where you can only deploy up to a certain number of units, Thracia also has a minimum deployment threshold where you have to deploy at least X number of units, which means it's not as simple as just deploying Leif and getting him to the escape point or the seize point. Like, you have to deploy other units, and you definitely want those units to be ones that have been trained up to some effect or seem particularly useful for the map that you're going up against, especially because in the escape maps, Leif has to escape last. Otherwise, you lose any other units that were on the field when Leif escaped. And so sure, there could be instances where you have a bunch of fodder units that you don't care about keeping and you just warp Leif to the escape point and move on, but because of how limited your resources are, you really don't want to do that ideally. And even then, how many times could you really get away with doing that before you kind of put yourself into a corner? Not only is there a deployment minimum and maximum for the number of units, you also don't have a choice as to where your units start. It is based on the order they are in the prep screen, but that is somewhat dependent on who you deployed in previous chapters, because units who don't get deployed will get pushed down on the list, and then that'll affect where they get placed. It's kind of a whole thing, and I get that this is something that the game is balanced around and that veteran players can prepare for and take advantage of and whatnot, but I generally don't think that this limitation is a good one. There are some chapters where it makes sense not being able to choose where certain units start because, like I've been saying, you're on the back foot, so the enemy is able to narratively catch you off guard in a lot of instances, and not being able to choose your deployment order reflects that yet again in the gameplay. But for the vast majority of chapters, I don't see why there couldn't be an option to choose where units start. And you don't even get a deployment screen until chapter 8, which alone was a huge relief, and I didn't really pay much mind to deployment order in the first several chapters after having the deployment screen show up. It largely didn't make much of a difference, but the further I got, I noticed that deployment order started mattering a lot more. And there is a patch called Lil Manster that does allow you to move the deployment order around. It's a little bit tedious, but I mean, considering the game wasn't built with that feature in mind, it's pretty impressive. It's one of those things that I patched in and it's just too little too late for me. I think if I started the game with that, then maybe I wouldn't have burnt out on this game as fast. It's really hard to say for sure. The thing with Fog of War is that unlike the later games where enemies are obscured behind the fog, but you can still see the layout of the terrain, in Thracia, you can't see anything. It's completely pitch black outside of your unit's range of vision. Would it be better if the Fog of War in this game functioned more like it does in the other Fire Emblem games with this mechanic? Yeah, and even to take it a step further, I think implementing some kind of system where even enemy units can't see your units outside of their range of vision would be nice too. Fog of War is pretty much always annoying to play around, and I just didn't find it to be even more annoying than usual. And then the fatigue system is where every action each one of your units takes increases their fatigue meter. And once that fatigue meter exceeds that unit's maximum HP, they become fatigued, which means that on the following map you cannot deploy them. Unless, of course, you find a stamina drink and put it in their inventory during prep. And this is a system that I would say I largely didn't come across major issues with it. Now, there were times where a unit was close to being fatigued and I opted not to deploy them so that they could refresh their fatigue meter so I could potentially use them in the next map. And that was primarily when I thought I could get away with not deploying them. If there was a unit that I felt a lot of pressure to use in that particular map, I would go ahead and do it. There was almost always an alternative unit to use, and I do like that it de-incentivizes you from just steamrolling with a singular unit the entire time, because no matter how cracked a particular unit can be, they're gonna have to sit out at least one map eventually. And typically whenever that unit was extremely crucial to my victory, I didn't feel like I needed them that desperately on the following map. Like, could it have been useful in certain cases to deploy Ossian or Matcha, who was a big early game carry for me, or some other units in some of those maps that I couldn't deploy them in? Like, yeah, maybe, but it didn't particularly feel all that detrimental. I never really had more than a few units fatigued at a time, and more often than not, it was just 1 or maybe 2 on average. It prevents you from just dumping EXP into a small handful of units. You have to diversify who you're using to some effect. One small thing I did fail to mention is that staff users can fail to use their staves. I think there's something to do with the speed stat differential between the unit using the staff and the unit that they're using the staff on. I would look it up if you want the absolute specific details, but the point is staff users can miss. I mentioned this a little earlier too about how chapter 5 took me a lot of rolls, and a good number of those was because Nana missed some heals that were pretty crucial. But then it's like, okay, why are you putting yourself in a position where you are banking on a heal that may fail? Staves generally in this game are very powerful, be it from the enemy side of things or from the player side of things, which is why they are a very rare commodity with very limited uses. But I think being able to miss healing spells in particular, or at least close range healing spells maybe, feels pretty bad. But then it's also balanced with ranged staves having unlimited range, which is pretty damn insane. It can allow you to warp skip some chapters, but I've already mentioned some things that do de-incentivize warp skipping in a lot of cases. It's something that feels weirdly balanced by, yet again, other systems that are at play here. And so as I've been, talking through my various points that I want to cover, I've been trying to think of what is it exactly about this game to where I just don't have a strong desire to finish it despite being so far, and I just can't quite come up with an answer. I mean, it's not like I burnt myself out in that I was playing it too frequently or for too long a sessions. I think that just a lot of the maps requiring so many rerolls for me, which yeah, skill issue, whatever, but it doesn't make it any less frustrating, right? When you're having to reroll chapters over and over and over and over again, not even to get it to go perfectly, even on some of my successful chapters that were on attempt whatever number it might have been, sometimes I had to make sacrifices, using more uses of a certain item or weapon than I would have liked to, or some of the worst cases, losing a unit that had historically been pretty strong to that point. This game is way more about long-term preparation than it is about short-term, and short-term prep is still important, but another big component to the difficulty of this game is the communication of how certain systems work, and just game knowledge in general. The more you know about how this game functions and what to expect in certain cases, the easier of a time you're gonna have. And you might think, okay, no duh, because that applies to most games out there, especially turn-based ones, but it's really especially so in this game, which is why a lot of veterans of this game recommend not going into this game blind. It's definitely recommended to be familiar with the series at the very least. Even if there are systems that are unique to this game, I felt like a lot of the Fire Emblem games that I've played over the past year and a half or so since I started talking about them on the channel had really helped with my ability to get as far in this game as I did. I don't think that if I had started this game a year and a half ago that I would have been able to even get past chapter 5, for instance. It was an experience that kind of forced me to rethink my approach on several occasions, but also because of how important the long-term prep is in this game, I do think that if I restarted Thracia from the beginning, which I'm not going to do now, but someday when I decide to come back to this game, I'd definitely be able to prepare more thoroughly for the more difficult chapters. And I'm very accepting of that. There are games that on a first play maybe are frustrating from certain standpoints because you don't know either where things are located or how certain systems work or like whatever it might be. But then on subsequent playthroughs, you can kind of circumvent some of those pitfalls and capitalize on your knowledge of the game. And something that the developers could not have predicted at the time was that people, let alone Americans or just non-Japanese people in general, were going to go out of their way to download an emulator, get access to a Japanese copy of the game, use a translation patch that was made by very passionate fans in these various territories and countries and whatnot, and then play this thing without the context of having bought it complete in box. That circumstance probably never crossed their mind in the late 90s, and why would it? But at the same time, it does make for a game that is, in my experience, kind of uniquely obtuse. Genealogy's kind of a similar way, but sure, I had seen some videos on Genealogy before really fully jumping into it, but it's not like I retained a lot of the minutia. It was more so that I felt like I was more easily able to learn some of the unique aspects to Genealogy as I was playing it. But by the point in Thracia where I felt like I was getting more of a grip on a lot of the systems, I was too far in to want to restart. I also don't feel like I really screwed myself that heavily either, to the point where I couldn't beat the game. I just don't really care to, but I want to care to. And so that's kind of the frustrating aspect to me, more so than the various systems and idiosyncrasies present in the game itself. Of the Fire Emblem games that I've talked about that I haven't finished, this is probably the one that I would prioritize giving another chance sooner than the other games that I didn't finish, but got to a very similar point in progression-wise, with the exception of FE12, which I only played about half of. But when it came to FE6 and Conquest, I also stopped in those games at around the chapter 20, 21-ish mark, which is kind of interesting. And I guess I feel similarly as I did with Fate's Conquest, but I don't feel nearly as negative on Thracia as a whole, because at least I like some of the unique systems, whereas in Fates, I'm just not super crazy about some of the unique systems present there. And I was also enjoying the story a lot more in Thracia. Pretty much all of these systems synergize very, very well together. The fatigue system, the deployment limit, the map objectives, the low stat caps, a lot of that stuff melds really well together to create something that feels very cohesive, especially with how a lot of those limitations reflect the narrative, as I keep saying. I mean, as someone who's now experienced both Jugdral games, even if I didn't finish Thracia, I played the vast majority of it. I'm just more curious than anything to see what the remakes are going to be. Prior to playing Thracia and really having a deeper knowledge on it, not that I would say my knowledge is deep, but my knowledge on it was pretty shallow. I had previously said I think Thracia would make more sense as like a big paid expansion, but I don't think that really does it justice. I think it's mostly the name being, you know, the country and year the game takes place in makes it feel like it wouldn't be as marketable, because let's be honest, that name is not very good. I'd be curious to know what the other Fire Emblem games would be called if they were named similarly. It sounds like some Dewey Decimal System shit or whatever, as opposed to like an actual title, but they can call the remake something different. But I struggle to come up with specific things that I would want to see changed. It's really just the little tweaks that I mentioned kind of having an issue with, or thinking it didn't necessarily add that much, like deployment order in most cases, staff accuracy when it comes to at least allied units, of course, and maybe the accessibility of door keys, because it seemed like there was a possibility of being soft locked in certain instances if you didn't have enough door keys. I was particularly nervous about that in the last chapter that had doors. I managed to scrape by through excessive save state scumming, which I did my best to avoid. As my interest kind of waned, I started using save states, and then I started using them more and more and more. And yeah, that probably is a factor in diminishing my enjoyment, but it wasn't something that I started using until my enjoyment was already diminished by a serious margin. And I tried to use them pretty tastefully until just the past maybe 2 or 3 chapters or so, at which point I'm not really feeling it. But maybe being able to save halfway through a map was able to ease my mind and allowed me to not potentially tilt. That is something that I'll get into more when I get around to talking about Three Houses, is the whole time rewind thing. I'm sure that there's some way that they could integrate that into these remakes in a way that makes sense. Like, hey, Sigurd, here's some magical artifact that was passed down in your family, or a present from Arvis that allows you to rewind or something. There's issues with that though, in genealogy in particular, and those who are familiar with genealogy can guess what I would say if I was going to spoil things, which I'm not going to. And Thracia, kind of the same deal. I guess you could say the same for Shadows of Valentia, like, oh, if Alm had Milla's turn wheel in story events, then you simply would just rewind, and they clearly didn't. So it is this kind of disconnect. I get why it's there mechanically. I talked a little bit about it in my Shadows of Valentia video, and there's definitely more to say on it because it became much more egregious in Three Houses. And I would just love to see map saves come back from the DS games. The more Fire Emblem games I have played since I played Shadow Dragon, which I guess hasn't been that many, but the more I think about it, at least, I do think map saves are the answer, or at least have it be a toggle, right? Maybe it's only available on easy mode, or maybe that is the easy mode, for instance, in a game like Thracia, where making an easy mode is tough because it's not based on stats or volume of units. Like, yeah, I guess you could cut back on the volume of units or cut back on enemy stats, but the challenge really is mostly from your limited resources and the unique challenges that are thrown at you, and having to be a little scrappier in your methodology and your approach. There were a lot of times where I had to get pretty creative in this game to pass a particular obstacle that seemed otherwise impossible if you were to simply just approach it like most other Fire Emblem games, which is why I thoroughly understand the appeal of this game and why the people who love this game love it so hard. I think that's all I have to say on Fire Emblem Thracia 776. As far as Fire Emblem is concerned, Three Houses and Engage are definitely next. Three Houses is a massive game. Within that first year that it came out, I put in an obscene amount of time into it. I've played all the routes, most of which multiple times. There's a lot there for me to talk about by sheer, volume of content in the game, but also for how much I really love that game too. I know that that is going to be a massive time sink, and it's going to take a long time for me to not only play through the game, game, but synthesize my thoughts on it to put into a video. I think it's safe to bank on me doing multiple videos on Three Houses. It's just a matter of how I want to tackle that. And especially so since this year is Three Houses' 5th anniversary, I would like to get through it, make the videos on it, and then move on to probably Three Hopes first, and then Engage. I could probably play both at the same time to some effect though, because Three Hopes is an action game, whereas Engage is that more traditional strategy RPG. However, before I get into Three Houses, I've been meaning to play the Devil Survivor games over on the Megami Tensei side of things. I want to at least start Devil Survivor Overclocked before getting back into Three Houses. That's generally the game plan going forward. I've almost talked about all the Fire Emblem games, well, kind of period, but particularly all the ones that I want to talk about. I don't really feel a super strong draw to go play the original 3, even though I've dabbled with FE3 in particular here and there. If I do end up randomly deciding to jump into those, then maybe I'll talk about them, but no plans for that. Let me know what you guys think about Fire Emblem Thracia 776. I know this entry is particularly scary, and understandably so. You definitely don't want to jump into this as your first Fire Emblem game, let alone your second, because you should play Genealogy before this, but I wouldn't recommend starting with Genealogy if you were to jump into this series. I think it's kind of fitting for Thracia to be one of the last Fire Emblem games that I am playing for the first time, as opposed to it being earlier on when I was experimenting with different games in the series and figuring out what clicks and what doesn't. I hope I've maybe opened your eyes to it a little bit more. It's definitely not a game to be taken lightly and just kind of jumping into on a whim. It's something you kind of do want to prepare for, but I think it's worth checking out, if only to just see the narrative and gameplay synergy. See, I brought it back to the very first Fire Emblem video I did on the channel somehow. And ultimately, I think this game is really commendable in that way. And then I suppose also, if you're very experienced with Thracia, I'm curious to hear what you think about the potential, and I would say eventually inevitable remake. At least I would hope that this game doesn't randomly get skipped over, but I guess you never know with how costly and time-consuming game development is these days. But Fire Emblem is bigger than ever, so I feel like Intelligent Systems could probably sell pretty much anything at this point. Although I know the public reception of Engage was a lot softer than Three Houses, so I'm very curious to get to that one eventually. I do want to thank my channel members as always, and shout out the Space Cowboy at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, of course, if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.